They burned the bodies. They sealed the archives. They silenced the names. And then, someone found a letter. A letter that was never meant to be read. Not by you, not by anyone. Buried in dust, folded in secrecy, and signed by a pope who swore he'd never seen it. It changes everything. For centuries, we've believed the Knights Templar were guilty of heresy, of blasphemy, of crimes against God and crown. But what if they weren't? What if they were innocent? And the Church knew it. Let your breathing slow. Let the light dim. What follows is not a tale of swords and glory, but of ink and silence, and of the strange, quiet places where truth tries to outlive its jailers. We begin not with fire and steel, but with parchment, and with a whisper the Church could not quite erase. You're walking down a corridor that smells like time. It's not dramatic, no echoing footsteps, no flickering torches, just the steady hush of stone and paper, as if the walls themselves have decided to speak in silence. The air is cool and faintly musty, flavored with candle wax and binding glue. You are deep within the Vatican's secret archives, though they don't call them that anymore. These days, it's the Apostolic Archive. The rebranding helps. Makes it sound less like a mystery novel and more like a filing cabinet. But the stories are still here. Somewhere beneath these vaulted ceilings and locked drawers lies a single letter, folded, faded, sealed once with wax, now cracked and brittle. It was found not long ago after centuries of misfiling or maybe deliberate concealment. No one agrees. What matters is what it says. It's called the Chignon Parchment, and it bears the papal seal of Clement V, the very pope who oversaw the destruction of the Knights Templar. In it, he absolves them, quietly, privately. He writes that their sins, those so-called heresies, the charges that justified torture and fire, were exaggerated, perhaps even fabricated, and he forgave them. But no one was told. The burnings went on, the trials continued, and that letter disappeared. Until now. You pause, not because of the letter, at least not only, but because this isn't just about one piece of paper. It's about what it means. If the Church already knew the Templars were innocent, why allow the executions? Why silence the truth? And why, centuries later, is that silence cracking? You sit with the question. Let it drift like incense. Let it settle in the corners of your mind, the way dust clings to old shelves and forgotten stories. Because the story of the Templars isn't over. It's not just a tale of warriors and crusades. It's a tale of secrets, written, stored, hidden, and sometimes burned. And somewhere between the lines, something remains. A shadow, a voice, a truth too inconvenient to forget, too dangerous to speak, and too stubborn to die. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Breathe, because the fire is long gone, but the ashes still whisper. You don't expect much from old ash. It looks light, like snow left out too long, harmless. But it clings soft, insistent, and impossible to sweep away entirely. You brush your fingers along the edge of a crumbling manuscript in a medieval archive, and it answers back with a faint smear of soot. Not from today, not even from this century. This ash is older than memory, older than war, and in some cases, it is all that remains. In the years that followed the arrests of the Knights Templar in 1307, a quiet fire began to spread. Not the kind that roars with heat and screams, but the kind that works through drawers and shelves, that starts with a candle left just a little too close to a scroll. A smudge on a corner. A sudden dampness in a parchment room after a storm. And in more than one monastery, a complete loss, an entire scriptorium gone to flame or water with nothing left but ghostly outlines where books had once stood. Officially, it was bad luck, faulty storage, rats, mildew, carelessness. But over time, patterns emerge. Fires always seem to reach the right rooms, and never the ones stacked with songs or genealogies. Inquisitors' letters remain. Psalms are untouched. But records from the Templar trials, whole transcripts, are singed, soaked, or suspiciously vanished. You're not the first to notice. In the archives of Montreuil-Bellay, a minor French town, there are notes dated to the 1320s describing damp rot that destroyed a chest of legal documents, curiously, only those pertaining to the trial of a local Templar commander. In Avignon, years later, a cataloging monk adds a hesitant footnote to a missing volume possibly lost to the northern fire. But the church in question was made of stone, and the fire left no trace on the walls. More recently, in 1944, during World War II, a British bomb destroyed part of the Vienna Stadtarchiv. Among the ashes were rare 14th-century transcriptions of the Templar interrogations sent to Austria for safekeeping by the Habsburgs. The building next door, housing copies of municipal tax records, survived untouched. Even fire, it seems, can be selective when it's told where to go. So you start to wonder, is it coincidence or something else? Is it simply that Templar records were less valued, more carelessly stored? Or was someone making sure certain pages didn't make it through history intact? There's a smell to old fire. Even after centuries, the scent lingers in the bindings. You can almost catch it when you lift a charred corner, when the air shifts and carries something ancient into your lungs. The archivists wear gloves, not because the documents are cursed, but because the oils in your skin might smudge the last words ever written by a condemned man. And some of those words, if they still existed, might tell a very different story. One of the few intact records from the early trial years mentions a document known as the Red Codex. It's referred to once briefly by an inquisitor in Toulouse. The codex in the red binding, which contained the account of the prior's confession under duress, was dispatched to the papal legate. No such codex has ever been found. No red bindings remain. But archivists whisper about it, still about whether it was real and who made it disappear. Of course, there's always the counter-argument: preservation is messy. Fires happen. Mold is patient. Rats aren't picky. But the silence is just too consistent. When you compare diocesan libraries across Europe, those that kept Templar trial records and those that didn't, the losses skew suspiciously toward the ones that once held damning contradictions. There's also the curious case of San Calogero in Sicily. In the mid-1800s, a restoration of its crypts uncovered a sealed chest behind a false panel. Inside, several rolls of parchment, many water-damaged but one nearly whole. It included an inventory of Templar holdings in Palermo and the mention of a letter from Clemens to the local bishop instructing him to observe mercy. The letter naturally is gone. Stolen or lost during the fascist era, depending on which curator you ask. You can't help but think of the Chignon parchment again. That rare letter of absolution signed by Pope Clement V himself survived only in a misfiled bundle discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001, and even then its release came quietly, almost reluctantly. No press release, no grand rethinking of the Templar legacy, just another piece of forgotten paper, another crack in the carefully plastered wall of history. Maybe that's what the ash is really about. Not destruction, but delay. Delay the story long enough, and fewer people will care when the truth finally rises through the soot. You notice how often the records mention fire, and how rarely they say how it started. You read between the lines. One scribe blames a lightning strike on a clear day. Another speaks of unseasonable dampness in a stone room without windows. The air becomes thick with implication, and the pattern begins to write itself. There's something almost poetic about the way archives die. Quiet, smokeless sometimes. One moment they exist, and the next they're fragments, husks, whispers of what once was. And if enough of those whispers are erased, then history itself begins to forget. But not entirely. Because for every fire a survivor remains. A copy, a marginal note, a half-burned scroll someone tucked under a robe and walked away with. Evidence doesn't vanish all at once, it fades. And in that fading, something lingers. You remember the Montreuil-Bellay fire again, and how the records that survived were bound in a different material, oiled leather, not cloth, and how only the Templar files had been bound in cloth. That detail doesn't make it into the official report, but it's there scribbled in the corner of a cataloger's diary from 1923. Curious choice of bindings, almost as if someone wanted them to burn. You lean back, let the thought settle. Let it mix with the scent of smoke that isn't quite there. Because the truth, like fire, leaves behind a mark, even when the page is gone. And in the next room, sealed in an envelope bearing the papal seal, another mark is waiting. The bells of Avignon toll with a slow, meditative rhythm. You imagine them ringing through the fog of a cool spring morning in 1312, their sound echoing off the walls of the papal palace, a palace not yet finished, but already heavy with consequence. Behind one of its high windows, a figure in white sits silently at a writing table. His face is pale drawn and perhaps more tired than devout. He is Pope Clement V, and in this moment, he is not praying. He is reading. Or rather, deciding whether to keep reading. The document before him is not the first of its kind. Reports from inquisitors across France, England, Aragon, and beyond have begun to pour in, some forced from tortured lips, others carefully constructed confessions designed to please their interrogators. Most accuse the Knights Templar of heresy, kissing demons, spitting on the cross, worshipping a bearded head with gemstone eyes. The usual medieval nonsense just polished for royal consumption. But now Clement reads something else, something different. This report is calmer, more factual. It's a transcript of Templar testimonies taken not by royal officers, but by the Pope's own envoys, and the tone is almost dull. No mention of demons, no secret rites. Just worn men explaining that they were taught to obey, to fight, and to protect pilgrims. The most damning thing one of them admits is that he didn't always understand the Latin prayers he was taught to recite. You picture Clement setting down the parchment, his fingers lightly tapping the edge. He is not a man given to rash decisions. He was never supposed to be pope at all, merely a compromise candidate during a tense conclave chosen more for diplomacy than divine charisma. He had no appetite for war or blood, and certainly not for the burning of hundreds of knights. But there was pressure, the kind that doesn't arrive in sermons but in letters bearing royal seals. Especially the seal of Philip IV of France, Philip who owed massive debts to the Templars. Philip who had already arrested them en masse before even consulting Rome. Philip who insisted with increasing sharpness that the Pope must act or be seen as complicit in their sins. It's here that the papal silence begins. For months, Clement's letters grow colder, shorter. He stops defending the Templars publicly. He pauses efforts to reassign their lands. He delays his verdict. Historians have long debated why. Some believe Clement was simply overwhelmed. Others argue he was genuinely uncertain, torn between political reality and spiritual obligation. And then there are those who think something darker happened, that Clement was shown something proof real or forged, that convinced him the Templars were indeed a threat. But there is no such evidence in the records. What exists instead is a strange vacuum of decision-making. After convening the Council of Vienne in 1311, intended in part to resolve the Templar issue, Clement delays the vote, then delays it again and again. At one point, he even suggests forming a new crusade and merging the Templars with another order. A compromise. A way out. That idea doesn't survive the week. What is notable, though, is a shift in the tone of his advisors. Memos begin to circulate warning that inaction would serve to weaken papal authority, and that discord with the French throne must be avoided at all costs. The threat wasn't theological, it was political. If Clement exonerated the Templars, he risked losing the alliance with France, the most powerful Catholic kingdom in Europe. And then there is the matter of Clement's health. Throughout 1312, he begins to deteriorate. Contemporary accounts describe stomach pains, seizures, and fatigue. Some whispered poison, though that may be the usual medieval flair for scandal. Regardless, his mind was not at ease, and still no verdict. Until suddenly, quietly, there was. In March 1312, without ceremony, Clement issued the papal bull Vox in excelso. It did not declare the Templars guilty. It did not mention heresy. Instead, it simply dissolved the order by apostolic ordinance, citing the scandal surrounding them as sufficient reason. No trial, no judgment. Just silence punctuated by a signature and a date. The Church, he said, would take no further action. But that wasn't quite true. You remember, of course, the Chinon parchment, the letter from Clement himself, absolving the Templar leadership. It was written months earlier in secret. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged until it was discovered nearly 700 years later. If Clement had truly believed in their guilt, why sign such a letter at all? And if he believed in their innocence, why not publish it? That contradiction lies at the heart of this chapter. Clement's silence was not ignorance. It was calculation. He knew something, and he chose not to speak. The consequences were immediate. Within weeks of Vox in excelso, Templar property began transferring to the Hospitallers. Some of it. Other parts were quietly seized by local lords or lost in transition. The knights themselves, at least those not already dead, were scattered, imprisoned, penniless, unwanted, and Clement. He died 2 years later, in bed. No final revelations, no last-minute confessions, just silence. The same silence that had begun when he read that first simple report, the one with no demons, no idols, just frightened men who insisted they were loyal, who believed the Church would hear them out. Sometimes the absence of a verdict is more damning than a sentence. A guilty verdict can be overturned. A public trial, however flawed, invites scrutiny. But silence buries. It allows the world to move on uncorrected, unchallenged. And yet, the letter remained, buried, hidden, waiting for someone to find it. You breathe in slowly. The room is still. The only sound is the rustle of turning pages, the soft thud of thought landing somewhere deep. Clement's silence may have echoed for centuries, but even echoes eventually find a wall. In the town of Chinon, an old fortress still stands. Beneath its towers, somewhere in a forgotten drawer, the absolution of the Templars once lay sleeping. And for a moment, history held its breath. It's strange how the truth sometimes chooses the quietest places to hide. Chinon isn't the kind of town that makes bold declarations. It lies low along the Vienne River, its houses pressed close like they're still afraid of something. The castle looms above, part ruin, part monument, part museum. But beneath it, beneath the stones worn smooth by pilgrims, prisoners, and kings, something far more fragile once waited. A parchment, unassuming, small, and utterly damning. You imagine the room where it was written, not grand, not holy, just cold, echoing stone, a flickering lantern, and a table stained with wax and history. It is the year 1308. The Pope has sent 3 cardinals to interrogate the top leaders of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, Hugues de Perrot, and Geoffroy de Gonneville, among others. The arrests are still fresh. The accusations swirl. The King of France has declared them heretics. The public believes it. The Church is still deciding. And here in this fortress-turned-prison, the deciding begins. The Chinon parchment, because that's what we call it now, was discovered by accident in 2001 by a Vatican archivist named Barbara Fraile, misfiled, not lost in some Indiana Jones warehouse full of cobwebs and dramatic music, just sitting quietly in a stack of routine correspondence labeled incorrectly. Overlooked for 7 centuries. What it contains is as surprising as its survival. The document records that the 3 cardinals acting on behalf of Pope Clement V formally absolved the Templar leaders of heresy. They heard their confessions, they weighed their words, and then they forgave them. Not a pardon for political convenience, not a clever dodge, a clear statement. They were not guilty of the spiritual crimes for which they would later be executed. Let that settle for a moment, because it didn't matter. You see, while this absolution occurred in 1308, it never made its way into public knowledge. It was never read aloud, never included in the proceedings at the Council of Vienne, never used to prevent the burning of Jacques de Molay 6 years later on an island in the Seine. The Chinon parchment was signed sealed and shelved. Some suggest it was forgotten, bureaucratic clutter. Others believe it was intentionally suppressed, its implications too dangerous, its contradictions too vast. How could the Church justify executing men they had already forgiven? How could they explain the silence? There's a whisper in that paper. You almost hear it when you imagine the scribe dipping his quill, copying the testimonies, the names, the absolution. Maybe he hesitated. Maybe he looked around. Maybe he knew this wouldn't see the light. But he wrote it anyway. Even more haunting, the Templar leaders signed it too. Their marks, faint and formal, sit just above the final seal. It was real to them. They believed their words would matter, that this hearing was their salvation. But history had other plans. And you wonder why Chinon? Why not Avignon or Rome? The choice seems strange until you remember how sensitive this matter was. Chinon was under French control, but far from Parisian influence. It was remote enough to keep things quiet, but official enough to seem legitimate. A stage set for truth, then hastily struck once the curtain fell. There's also the timing. When the Chinon interrogations were conducted, public sentiment was shifting. Some nobles had begun to question the arrests, the brutality, the suddenness. And Pope Clement, perhaps genuinely unsure, was still gathering facts. The Chinon parchment could have formed the backbone of a reconciliation. It could have saved lives. But it didn't. Instead, the king's voice grew louder. France's coffers remained empty. The public needed closure, and Philip IV knew how to write the ending he wanted. With fire. Still, the parchment survived. It's written on sheepskin, as most documents of its type were, and bears an ink that has darkened with age but not faded. The Latin is dry, formal, but unmistakable in its meaning. The Church knew, and for 700 years it didn't tell you. Imagine that, 700 years of silence with the truth sitting politely in a misfiled folder, not hidden in some crypt or chest, but in a drawer, waiting for someone to care enough to read it. And when it was finally found, The Vatican didn't issue a press release. There was no official revision of the Templar narrative. The parchment was quietly authenticated, quietly digitized, and then quietly acknowledged, which in a way feels fitting. The Templars lived and died in the liminal spaces between church and state faith and finance protection and suspicion. Their absolution, like their downfall, existed in a haze of politics and paper. They were cleared by ink, then burned by fire. You trace your finger along the imagined edge of that parchment, its surface rough and stiff with age. You wonder how many hands touched it, how many eyes skimmed it without understanding what they were holding. Maybe some of them did understand and chose to say nothing. The Chinon parchment forces you to reframe everything. The trials, the verdicts, the executions, they weren't justice. They were performance. The outcome was already written. The truth was an inconvenient footnote too delicate for an angry age. And still, that fragile footnote survived. In later chapters, you'll see how this single document becomes a ghost at the feast, how it haunts later papal decisions, how it creates small fractures in the Church's official memory. But for now, let it stand on its own, an echo from a dark room in a quiet fortress where 3 men thought they were being heard. It's not just the parchment that whispers. It's what it represents, the hope that truth, however briefly acknowledged, might still leave a trace. And in the dust of Chinon, it did. You're standing in a narrow room lined with drawers that hum with silence. Each drawer is labeled in precise handwritten Latin bulle decreta acta. To the untrained eye, it all looks harmless, just paper in boxes, wax under glass. But archivists know better. They know that a sealed envelope, especially one from the 14th century, isn't just an artifact. It's a warning label in disguise. Somewhere in a regional archive just outside Poitiers, a clerk found one, folded into an envelope of stiff parchment sealed with red wax cracked like desert earth. It bore the mark of a cardinal, the signum of Berengar Fredol, one of Clement V's close allies, and a key figure in the Templar inquiry. The envelope was clearly labeled ad non aperiendum sine, licentia papalis. Do not open without papal permission. But papal permission has been hard to come by since 1378, so they opened it. The contents weren't grand. No confession of guilt. No lost gospel. Just a single tightly written letter, dated 1310, addressed to a bishop in Normandy. And yet, it sent a shiver down every spine in the room. The letter described a final judgment delivered orally to certain Templar knights, one that acknowledged their spiritual error, not as heresy, but as a deviation of practice born from ignorance. In short, a reprimand, not a damnation. What made it remarkable, however, was the instruction that followed. The bishop was told not to act. "You will not publish this," the letter reads, "until instructed." The instruction never came. For 700 years, the seal held. The letter remained unread, and its quiet plea for patience turned into a tombstone for a truth that might have changed everything. You begin to notice a pattern. These weren't lost documents in the classic sense. They were intentionally paused, set aside, deferred into obscurity. The seal wasn't to protect the message, it was to delay it. Think of the timing. In 1310, the Templar trials had reached fever pitch. Dozens of knights had confessed, some under torture, some under threat. Heresy had become the word of the hour. Clement V was wavering, pressured from both sides. The French crown wanted executions. The Church wanted unity. And somewhere in the middle sat letters like this, bearing truths that were neither convenient nor ignorable. It's here that historical fact steps in. We know from church records that Clement established a two-track system for handling the Templar affair, one public, one private. The public records showed stern declarations, procedural inquiries, and eventual dissolution. But the private record scattered across letters like this one suggests something else entirely: hesitation, forgiveness, and even regret. Of course, there's no official admission of guilt from the papacy. That's not how the church works. It doesn't retract, it reframes. But this letter reframes a great deal. It implies that key bishops were told to wait, to withhold, to bury the question until the politics shifted. And the politics never shifted. Why was this letter sealed in the first place? Some suggest it was merely protocol, a means of protecting communications in an age when mail traveled by mule and interception was common. But then why the label forbidding its opening without papal license? Why was it filed under non-acta non-actions, rather than in the bishop's correspondence register? Perhaps the answer lies not in what the letter said, but in what it prevented. If the bishop had published the absolution locally, it could have spread. It could have swayed other clergy-inspired resistance or sparked doubt. Philip IV couldn't afford that. Neither, it seems, could Clement, and so the seal stayed closed. The wax hardened, the paper yellowed, and the truth inside fell asleep. It's not the only one. In Aragon, another sealed document was found in a monastery vault in the late 1800s, addressed to a Templar knight named Ramon de Serra. It congratulated him on his acquittal and instructed him to await reassignment. The reassignment never came. No one knows if the letter ever reached him, or if he died believing he'd been forgotten. Then there's the record from Mainz in the Holy Roman Empire, where a bishop writes of receiving sealed directives from Rome regarding the local Templars. Those directives, he claims, never arrived. No one knows what they said or whether they were intercepted, delayed, or quietly destroyed. You begin to understand how history doesn't just disappear, it gets sealed away. Filed, locked behind ceremony and protocol, until it becomes so old, so quiet, that no one dares disturb it. And when it is finally disturbed, it feels like a ghost is whispering in your ear. The Poitiers letter now sits in a climate-controlled drawer, its wax fragments preserved in glass. The seal itself tells a story, an image of St. Peter holding the keys of heaven, now cracked through the middle. You wonder if anyone back then knew what they were sealing. If Berengar Fredel paused before pressing his ring into the wax. If he felt even for a second that he was bottling a contradiction too heavy to hold. There's something so final about a seal. It implies authority control, an end to questioning. But what happens when the seal breaks, when someone centuries later lifts the flap and finds a message that rewrites the past? In this case, nothing explosive. No revolution. No Vatican apology. Just a small ripple in the historical current, a footnote with teeth. A reminder that the narrative we accept is often just the version that reached us unburned, unbroken, and unsealed. And behind every version that survives, there are others still folded, still waiting. In the next archive, the next drawer, the next broken seal. The room smells of parchment and beeswax, but beneath that you can almost catch the scent of fear, ancient, well-aged like wine turned vinegar. You're standing in the royal chancery of early 14th century France, at least in your mind. The place where Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, wove one of the most aggressive campaigns of political sabotage the medieval church would ever endure. And somewhere in this room, tucked among tax decrees and property registers, is a letter never meant to be read outside his closest circle. It's short, blunt, almost cruel in its efficiency. Dated just months before the mass arrest of the Templars in 1307, the letter is addressed to Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chief legal advisor, and a man with all the warmth of a whetstone. The memo, recovered from a collection of personal documents in the French National Archives in 1895, was originally dismissed as routine. But then someone read it more carefully. In it, Philip instructs Nogaret to ensure the coordination of local inquiries in such a way that public panic shall be avoided until the appropriate hour. He also mentions the redistribution of detained assets, not as you might expect after the trial, but in anticipation of the arrests. The wording suggests a decision had already been made. The knight's guilt was a foregone conclusion. This isn't an order for investigation. It's an order for cleanup. You pause. Because this changes things. Historians have long debated whether Philip genuinely believed in the charges against the Templars, or whether he fabricated them as a means of canceling his debts and seizing their property. This letter doesn't resolve that debate outright, but it adds weight to the latter theory. It paints Philip not as a reluctant monarch caught in theological confusion, but as a calculating tactician preparing for a land grab. And then there's the phrase, ensure the spiritual justifications are documented in accordance. Not discovered, not debated, documented. The Templars were in effect already condemned. Philip had reason to act. His wars with England and Flanders had drained the royal treasury. He'd already expelled the Jews from France in 1306, seizing their wealth. The Templars were next. They were rich. They were organized. They had castles, land influence, and perhaps most importantly, international reach. If Philip could break them, he'd send a message to every noble in France: no one stands above the crown. But breaking them required more than swords. It required narrative. That's where Nogaret came in. A master of legal manipulation, he understood that to dismantle the Templars effectively, they had to be more than inconvenient. They had to be monstrous. Accusations of heresy were perfect. They evoked revulsion and fear. Best of all, they bypassed the need for standard legal trials. Heretics could be tortured. Their confessions accepted under duress. Their property seized. You remember the confessions from Section 4, the men in Chinon who begged to be heard. The king's memo, discovered centuries later, confirms what they likely suspected: no one was listening. There's a cruel elegance in how Philip timed the arrests. On October 13th, 1307, a Friday, hundreds of Templars were seized across France in a coordinated strike. The date would later contribute to the superstition around Friday the 13th, though at the time, it was just the morning the church failed to stop a crown. The papacy was notified after the fact. Pope Clement V, blindsided, tried to assert control over the trials, but found himself repeatedly outmaneuvered. The king had the momentum. He had the public. He had the paperwork. And apparently, he had the memos. The original copy of Philip's instruction to Nogaret vanished sometime in the late 17th century. The version we know comes from a meticulous 16th century copy entered into a legal archive in Bourges. Marginal notes from the scribe include a hesitant line. If this is true, then judgment was not divine but royal. Of course, nothing in the memo explicitly says, "frame the Templars." Philip was too clever for that. But the language is unmistakably premeditative. There's no discussion of guilt, only process, outcome, logistics. Even today, the Church rarely comments on this document. It isn't technically part of the ecclesiastical record. It belongs to the royal files, an internal memo between a king and his fixer. But its existence complicates every other page, every confession, every burning, every silence. It also adds another layer to the Chinon parchment. Remember, the absolution issued there was quiet, private. It lacked teeth. Was it because the Pope knew even then that the machinery had already moved too far? That Philip had his narrative, and no parchment, no seal, no whispered absolution would stop it? There's a fine line between justice and theater, especially when kings are involved. And Philip IV was a master dramatist. He staged the arrests, managed the optics, and reshaped the conversation. Even the surviving Templars, many of whom were simply pensioned off into obscurity, found themselves erased, not by fire, but by irrelevance. You imagine the moment that letter was delivered to Nogaret, perhaps in a velvet-lined pouch, perhaps sealed with a crimson ribbon. Maybe he opened it with a small, tight smile, knowing exactly what was being asked. Maybe he didn't flinch. And now, centuries later, here you are, reading its echo, feeling the coldness in its calculated phrases, the certainty in its tone, the finality in its planning. The king didn't need the church to find guilt. He just needed it to stay quiet long enough. And for a while it did. For a long time it was convenient to pretend the Templar downfall was a uniquely French affair. A bad king, a nervous pope, a tangled mess of greed and theology confined neatly within the borders of France. But truth has a way of bleeding through the margins. And if you follow the threads beyond the Seine, east-south, across the Channel, you'll find that something was stirring in other places too. Something coordinated. Something larger. You begin in England. In early 1308, just months after the mass arrests in France, Edward II received a formal letter from Pope Clement V, urging him to take similar action against the Templars. At first, Edward hesitated. He even wrote back expressing doubts about the accusations. He called the charges unfounded and noted the order's long history of loyalty. But then, something changed. Within weeks, Templar properties across England were under lock and key. The knights weren't burned as they had been in France, but they were imprisoned, interrogated, their assets seized. The tone of English policy had turned sharply. Not just in law, but in language. Suddenly, ministers spoke of cooperating with the Holy See and maintaining the moral clarity of the realm. It's tempting to assume papal influence won the day. But tucked in the archives of Westminster is a record of something else, a communication not from Rome, but from Paris. A royal courier sent directly from Philip IV had met with English officials in late December of 1307. The notes from that meeting have survived only in fragments, but one phrase stands out. What begins in France must not be allowed to be isolated. That sounds less like a suggestion and more like a strategy. Then there's Italy. In Florence, a series of legal scrolls dated to 1309 show inquiries into foreign brotherhoods operating under false cross. The term is curious, clearly meant to obliquely reference the Templars without invoking them directly. Italian city-states were notoriously careful when it came to church politics. They preferred ambiguity over confrontation. Yet across Tuscany and Lombardy, subtle movements were underway. Templar commanderies were shuttered, inventories quietly taken. And while open arrests were rare, you begin to notice a chilling pattern. The order was being erased through paperwork, not fire. In Aragon and Castile, things took a stranger turn. The Crown of Aragon, led by King James II, was initially reluctant to move against the Templars. He wrote to Clement in early 1308 expressing confusion, even skepticism. But then in a series of rapid decisions, he ordered that Templar castles be secured and their members questioned for clarity. In one of the surviving court records from Zaragoza, a knight named Raimundo de Abella stated that he and his brothers had been warned before the papal orders arrived. Someone had tipped them off, They had begun burning sensitive records days before the royal inquest began. Not out of guilt, but out of fear that those records would be misunderstood or misused. It raises an uncomfortable question. If suppression was meant to be uniform and reactive, why were the reactions so similar across so many kingdoms, often before official edicts were delivered? Perhaps the orders didn't come from one place at all. Perhaps they came from multiple corridors of power, each acting under the illusion of divine coordination, but driven by very earthly concerns. One particular document in the archives of Valencia catches your attention. It's a letter unsigned but attributed by watermark to the papal nunciature. In it, the writer warns a local bishop that the cleansing of the order is essential to the perception of unity among kingdoms. That phrase, again, perception. Not truth, not justice, just the appearance of agreement. Across the Pyrenees in Portugal, the story takes yet another twist. There, King Denis I resisted the call to dissolve the Templars. Instead, in 1319, he simply renamed them. The Order of Christ was born Templar lands, repackaged Templar knights, recloaked in a new banner. Portugal's secret was thinly veiled, but it worked. The church approved the arrangement. The king kept the wealth, and the knights kept their lives. No flames, no trials, just rebranding. You step back and begin to see the shape of something larger than fear, larger than theology. What began in France wasn't an isolated act of justice, it was a template, a strategy, a rolling purge tailored to the needs and anxieties of each kingdom. Some used it to consolidate power, others to grab land. A few, like Portugal, simply sidestepped it with clever paperwork. And all of them, every last kingdom, received letters from Rome. Some historians call it a domino effect. Others use terms like spiritual containment or geopolitical compliance. But you know what it really was. It was a whisper campaign turned into law. A quiet pressure that traveled faster than horses. Not because it was shouted, but because it was passed hand to hand behind closed doors. One country, one king might have seemed paranoid. But when 5 or 6 begin acting in sync with the same language, the same urgency, the same vague instructions from the same confused pope, you begin to suspect coordination. And yet, no master document survives. No global memo. No explicit record of the moment where it all came together. Only fragments, echoes, like the letter in Aragon or the courier's note in England. Just enough to suggest that what happened wasn't spontaneous combustion, but controlled detonation. You return to the Chinon parchment, to the king's memo, to the sealed letters. Each felt like a singular piece, but now, like threads pulled tight across a map, they begin to converge. The lines stretch outward from Paris, twist through Rome, and knot themselves into corners of Europe you hadn't thought to look. The Templar trials weren't just a scandal. They were a system. And that system didn't end in France. There's a certain creak to old chains, the kind forged not just of iron, but of power. You hear it in the halls of every stone-walled prison where a man waits to confess what he may not believe. It's not the sound of guilt, it's the sound of survival. And if you listen closely, the confessions of the Templars carry that sound through the centuries. You begin with Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, whose final moments in 1314 have become legend. But years before the fire, he sat in a cell, face gaunt hands, likely bruised, answering questions that had answers already written. His first confession was brief and careful. He admitted to denying Christ under pressure. But later he recanted, saying his words were forced. Then, under renewed pressure, he confessed again. The records show a pendulum of guilt and innocence swinging not with conscience, but with pain. Molay's is not the only such record. Hundreds of Templars were interrogated across France and beyond. Some spoke quickly, hoping for mercy. Others resisted only to break after days, weeks, or longer. What ties them together is not consistency, but desperation. And it's here the historical fact emerges: the vast majority of Templar confessions were obtained under duress. Not all involved the rack or the branding iron. Sometimes sleep deprivation, darkness, and starvation did the trick. Other times it was the promise of release. One knight in Poitiers was told that his confession would spare him. It didn't. Another in Tours was promised freedom for implicating others. He named names. He died anyway. It's easy from the comfort of centuries to read these confessions as fact. Ink on parchment has a way of feeling final. But that ink was often scribbled by clerks, instructed to capture the sense, not the words. Many transcripts don't quote the Templars directly at all. They summarize, paraphrase, translate local dialects into formal Latin. And in that process, entire meanings shift. One document from Carcassonne presents a confession where the knight admits to spitting on the cross, a common charge. But a margin note, likely from a scribe unsure of the phrasing, reads, "He said he was told to make a gesture but does not recall doing so." The difference between symbolic obedience and true blasphemy hangs in that line. And then, of course, there are the missing records. Entire testimonies lost to fire rot or neglect. In the Toulouse archive, a binder labeled Templar Interrogations 113-9-8-1310 contains only blank pages. No one knows if they were erased or simply never copied over. Some speculate that damning details, either in favor or against the knights, were removed by scribes under orders to curate the evidence. After all, in a trial where the verdict was pre-written, the details just had to fit the script. That's not to say all the confessions were false. Some may have contained kernels of truth about internal discipline, secrecy, perhaps even odd rituals misunderstood by outsiders. But even if parts were real, the conditions under which they were obtained taint the whole. And here's the more uncomfortable truth: the Church knew it. A papal directive issued in 1310, preserved in a dusty volume in the Vatican Library, warns inquisitors not to use excessive methods of persuasion. It then adds, almost as an afterthought, that some may interpret this liberty as encouragement, which in practice it was. But perhaps most telling is the recurrence of certain phrases. Over and over in testimonies from Paris to Marseille, knights confess to denying Christ, kissing the base of the spine, or worshipping a head. The language is uncannily uniform. Identical phrasing, identical sin. Either the knights had been incredibly consistent in their blasphemy, or the scribes had been given a template. There's a modern term for this: leading the witness. But in the 14th century, it had another name: saving the soul. After all, if the Templars truly were heretics, then extracting a confession, even under torture, was an act of spiritual rescue. And if they weren't, well, God would sort it out. One particularly troubling testimony comes from a knight named Étienne de Fougères. His records show 3 separate sessions, each with a different outcome. In the first, he denies everything. In the second, he confesses under mild correction. In the third, he asks to amend his confession. His final words in the record are, "I will say whatever pleases you, but may God hear the truth." You imagine the moment: a small chamber, a sputtering torch, a man too tired to resist, too afraid not to. Around him, the scribes writing quickly, the inquisitor nodding with approval. The truth doesn't die in fire, it withers under pressure. And even more troubling is how these confessions were used, not to determine guilt, not to guide reform, but to justify a decision already made. The Pope read them, the King cited them, and future historians for centuries would lean on them as if they were pillars. But you standing now in the space between the words begin to see the cracks. Earlier we traced the Chignon absolution, the sealed letters, the King's memo. Each suggested that something deeper was at play. And here in these echoing confessions, we see how the machine worked. Not by proof, but by repetition. Not by evidence, but by exhaustion. What matters in the end isn't that the Templars confessed. It's that no one believed their denial. In late 1307, he appears on a roster of papal legates traveling to Poitiers. 2 months later, he's listed as an observer in the early Templar interrogations near Toulouse. In 1309, he's in Marseille, overseeing a secondary hearing for Templar captives. And in 1310, his signature is attached, albeit faintly, to a document processed through the English priory at Lincoln. That's an unusual career for a notary. The official line is that Imbert was sent to ensure procedural uniformity, to help standardize inquiry practices across Christendom. But some historians argue that his real task was something subtler. Not to investigate, but to curate, to ensure that the confessions collected the questions asked and the phrasing recorded all aligned with an already emerging narrative. That narrative, as you know by now, was one of guilt. In one case, a Templar knight in Burgundy objected to the wording of his written testimony. The transcript had him admitting to spitting on the cross, but he insisted that he'd only acknowledged being accused of it. Imbert was present at the session. A margin note in his own hand reads, "Reframed to reflect understanding, not denial." It's a quiet redaction, but a devastating one. And this isn't an isolated example. A document from the Lucca Tribunal in Italy contains a curious instruction, "Conform answers to the northern pattern." The phrase is vague, but scholars believe it refers to the structure of confessions collected in northern France, where Imbert had been active for over a year. The implication is that his involvement wasn't just administrative, it was stylistic. The story was being written with a consistent voice, and Imbert was holding the pen. What's more, he was trusted. Repeated references to him in papal letters refer to his discretion, his proven loyalty, and most tellingly, his alignment with the vision of His Holiness. Not the truth, not the facts. The vision. You wonder how one man could have so much quiet influence. But perhaps that's the trick. Influence doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers behind the curtain. It signs the right papers. It edits the inconvenient phrasing. It standardizes heresy. And yet, Imbert was not universally embraced. In a sealed letter from the Bishop of Girona to a fellow cleric, the bishop warns of a man from Avignon who smooths the parchment before the ink is dry. The metaphor is clear. Someone was manipulating the record before the truth could settle. Whether that someone was Imbert isn't stated directly, but the timing, the location, and the context all point one direction. There's a term archivists use, ghost editor. It refers to the unnamed hand that appears in multiple documents, adjusting, abbreviating, clarifying, but never signing. Imbert left his name, but often only in passing. As if he wanted to be forgotten, yet remembered just enough to control what came next. You begin to see his work in places he never even visited. The phrasing, the structure, the repetitive accusations that by now feel more like a script than testimony. And always, always, his influence tightens around the same few core themes: denial of Christ, obscene rituals, idol worship. It's not that he invented the charges, but he certainly helped give them legs. Was he acting on direct orders, or was he simply a believer swept up in the tide of certainty that often drowns nuance we don't know? His personal correspondence is lost. His name vanishes from official records after 1312. No burial site, no final appointment, just a handful of manuscripts and a trail of textual echoes. One theory suggests he became disillusioned, that he retired quietly perhaps to a monastic life weighed down by the machinery he'd helped operate. Another darker theory hints he may have been silenced, that someone realized he knew too much. But there's no evidence for either. Just silence. Still, his fingerprints linger. You remember Etienne de Fougères, the knight who said, "May God hear the truth." His confession, too, bears the hallmarks of Imbert's influence. The phrasing, the sequence, even the margin notes align with other documents bearing Imbert's quiet hand. You begin to realize the Templar affair wasn't just about burning men. It was about writing a story. And Guillaume Imbert, the notary no one remembers, might have been the story's chief editor. In this, he becomes a symbol. Not of evil exactly, but of how bureaucracy becomes belief, how repetition shapes memory, how a name, when repeated often enough in the shadows, becomes a ghost in the record. So you keep an eye out now whenever you turn a brittle page or scan a faded header. You look for the signs not of what was said, but of who decided how it would be said. And more often than not, you find him. The fire was supposed to be the end, a clean, close to a messy chapter. But as you stand at the edge of the Seine where smoke once curled into the March air of 1314, you realize it wasn't an ending. Not really. If anything, it was an ellipsis whispered in flame. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was the last of the order's great voices, and when he spoke his final words, flames licking at his robe ash in his throat. Those nearby said he did not curse, he did not plead. He called out for justice. What exactly he said depends on who's telling the story. Some accounts claim he cried, "God knows who is wrong and has sinned." Soon, a calamity will befall those who have condemned us. Others say he called Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to divine judgment. Both men, as legend goes, died within the year. It's tempting to see this as myth-making. Medieval minds were drawn to patterns, to moral equations, the wicked fall, the innocent rise, even if only in memory. But the strange case of Jacques de Molay defies tidy framing. Because in death, his story did not settle. It splintered. His first confession, as recorded in 1307, was vague. He admitted to denying Christ, but his phrasing was conditional. The record reads more like a paraphrased shrug than a firm statement. Days later, under heavier interrogation, he confessed again, this time more clearly. But months after that, he recanted publicly, declaring his earlier confessions lies forced from him through suffering. This cycle, confess, deny, repeat, became his pattern, and it confused nearly everyone, especially the clergy trying to record him. One scribe's margin note reads, "He speaks in riddles, perhaps from pain." But perhaps it wasn't pain. Perhaps it was strategy. Some believe Molay knew he couldn't win, that he gave false confessions not to save himself, but to protect others, perhaps to delay proceedings, to confuse the record, to buy time. He was, after all, trained in diplomacy and war. He knew how to maneuver. And his shifts in tone may not have been weakness, but calculated resistance. What makes his case even stranger is what didn't happen. Unlike other high-ranking Templars, Molay was not defrocked publicly. He was not handed over to a secular court until the very end. And his sentence, burned alive on an island in the Seine, came swiftly, almost as if someone feared what he might still say. His final refusal to affirm the Church's verdict prompted immediate execution, skipping the expected process. No more deliberations, no further appeals, just flame. But that fire lit more than wood. After his death, copies of Mole's earlier absolution began to quietly circulate. One fragment found in the Vatican secret archives centuries later describes a closed-door meeting in Chinon in 1308, where Pope Clement V and 3 cardinals privately absolved Mole and several other Templars. They declared the knights guilty of grave imprudence, but not heresy, not damnation. They were to be reconciled with the Church. So why was this not honored? Why was Mole still imprisoned, interrogated, and finally executed? The answer may lie in a single phrase from the Chinon document pending political stabilization. It's an odd thing to include in a spiritual judgment, but it reveals everything. The Pope knew the truth, at least the truth as his court saw it, but he also knew the political cost of announcing it. Philip IV had invested too much in the Templar purge. Reversing course could fracture their already brittle alliance. And Mole. He became the sacrificial buffer between two powers more interested in preserving face than uncovering truth. There's an obscure letter buried in the Avignon archives, written by a minor cleric named Bertrand d'Artois. In it, he describes attending the execution and records what he thought he heard Mole say: "I die innocent, and I summon those who have condemned me to God's tribunal." But Bertrand hesitates. He writes, "It was loud. I cannot be sure. But the men beside me crossed themselves and went pale." That one sentence speaks volumes. It suggests fear not of Mole, but of being present when something righteous was crushed. And perhaps that's what haunts history most. The fire didn't end the Templars. Not entirely. But it did close the mouth of their loudest defender. After Mole's death, the remaining members of the order either faded into obscurity, found refuge under new names, or melted into legend. But no one else had his authority, his clarity, his timing. His death was the period on a sentence the Church never dared fully write. You revisit his image, a tall man, white beard, singed eyes, unafraid. He doesn't scream. He doesn't curse. He speaks. And those who hear him remember, though they may lie about it later. Though they may redact or soften the words, some truth burned through anyway. It's there in the Chinon parchment, in the absolution never honored, in the Pope's silence, in the King's haste, and most of all in the way that even now we're still asking what he really said. History tends to bury what it fears. But sometimes in trying to silence a man, you make him immortal. When people hear the word Templar, their minds often jump to gold-lost hoards buried beneath cathedrals, secret vaults hidden in hillsides, treasure maps etched into the stone. And who can blame them? The idea is irresistible. But what if the real treasure wasn't metal at all? You stand now in the shadow of a crumbling commandery somewhere in Languedoc. Beneath your feet, there are no glittering coins, no gem-studded chalices, just layers of dust and stone, and if you're lucky, a few scraps of parchment sealed into clay urns long since forgotten. No one here ever found gold. But what they did find, a fragment of a star chart, a prayer written in Greek, a coded diagram half-erased linking solstice dates to lunar phases. Hardly pirates' loot, but curious, isn't it? In the 13th century, the Templars were not just warriors. They were landowners, bankers, engineers, and scholars. Their network stretched from Scotland to Cyprus. Their commanderies held archives, maps, correspondence data, knowledge. And in several cases, knowledge that seems ahead of its time. Take the Clairvaux Codex. It was discovered in the 18th century, tucked into the private library of an abbey slated for demolition. The manuscript contains detailed notes on agricultural rotations, water purification techniques, and oddly geometric ratios used in the construction of round towers. Nothing scandalous, Nothing magical, just startlingly sophisticated. The diagrams attributed to a Templar scribe include references to Arabic manuscripts and Greek philosophers. In the margins, phrases written in Hebrew and Syriac. The knowledge wasn't original, but it was collected, preserved, integrated. Some scholars argue this was the real mission of the Templars, not conquest, but curation. Not destruction, but synthesis. They traveled through Byzantium, through the Levant, through places where ancient learning hadn't been burned or banned, just quietly maintained. And perhaps in their campaign to protect pilgrims, they also became pilgrims of the mind. In a cellar beneath the former commandery of Leon restorers in the 1970s, found a carved stone slab with a circular design, a zodiac. But what caught attention wasn't the image itself, it was the calibration. The pattern suggested a knowledge of precession of axial tilt of cycles, not easily observed without decades of precise measurement. Too much, some argued, for medieval knights to understand, unless they weren't the ones who developed it, unless they were simply keeping it. You recall the charges brought against them. Worshipping a head, consulting spirits, drawing power from unnatural sources. But what if those weren't heresies? What if they were metaphors for knowledge, for secrets kept from the common clergy? Inquisition records often confused learning with heresy. A Templar knight who read Arabic texts might be accused of consorting with demons. A commandery with an astrolabe might be suspected of practicing divination. But perhaps the Church wasn't afraid of the Templars' beliefs, it was afraid of what they knew. A monk in Bologna once wrote that the order harbors questions that the Church dares not ask. He was reprimanded shortly after. And still the questions remain. Why did so many Templar commanderies include scriptoriums? Why did they maintain trading relationships with Islamic scholars even during Crusade periods? Why did some of their highest-ranking members request burial without crosses? Maybe they weren't abandoning faith. Maybe they were asking what lay beneath it. The Church had always defined orthodoxy not by what was true, but by what was safe. And in an age when translating a pagan text could get you burned, curiosity was dangerous. A knight who copied the stars, who annotated Aristotle, who mapped winds and tides and planetary conjunctions, such a knight would be seen not as a scholar, but as a threat. Some believe this knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, architectural, was the true treasure hidden in Templar vaults. And when the arrests began, it wasn't coins that disappeared. It was scrolls, instruments, maps, manuals. There's a story, probably apocryphal, of a wagon that left Paris just days before the arrests. It was said to contain the wisdom of the order. Eyewitnesses reported seeing cases, not chests, cylinders, not crates. The wagon was never seen again, but similar stories exist in Castile, in Tuscany, and Champagne. Always the same theme: knowledge moved under cover of darkness. Perhaps the vaults we dig for now were never buried in the earth. Perhaps they were buried in mines, in monasteries, in libraries too remote or too discreet to be searched. Or perhaps the knowledge was destroyed, not in fire but in silence, forgotten by choice. Left behind like a sealed room no one dared reopen. Even now we stumble across traces, an Arabic translation in a Cistercian monastery, a lost Templar map charting the Canary Islands a century before their official discovery, a set of construction techniques for Gothic vaults that no modern engineer can fully replicate. These aren't relics, they're fingerprints, and they raise a deeper question. What else did they know? You glance back at the documents we've uncovered so far, the Chinon parchment, the sealed memo, the coordinated trials. A pattern emerges, yes. But perhaps we've been focusing too much on the political destruction. Maybe that was only one part of the agenda. Maybe the rest, the part no one talks about, was to bury the questions. Not the men, not the gold, the ideas. You imagine a dusty room, quiet save for the faint scratching of a quill. A shaft of light cuts through a narrow window, catching floating motes. A monk bends over a page, tongue pressed between his teeth, copying a confession carefully, deliberately, just as he's been told. But the ink on the page isn't the whole story. Not always. Because for every interrogation transcript we read today, for every charter absolution or accusation that survived the centuries, there was someone who chose to preserve it, or alter it, or hide it. That's where the story twists. Behind every Templar record stands not just a knight or a king or a pope, but a scribe. And these scribes, they weren't just passive hands. They were architects of memory. Take the case of Brother Amalric, a monastic scribe active at the Abbey of Saint-Victor in Paris. In 1311, amid the heat of the trials, Amalric was tasked with transcribing testimony from Templars held nearby. His official records are crisp, clean, consistent. But one page nearly thrown out during a 19th century restoration revealed something else. On its back, faint and cramped, Amalric had copied a second version of the same testimony. The wording was different, softer. It implied coercion, doubt. Why copy both? Perhaps Amalric was hedging. Or perhaps knowing what would be demanded of him, he recorded what he truly heard, and what he was expected to record. In either case, it reveals the dangerous position scribes occupied. They were the keepers of contradiction, and sometimes the only ones left who knew where the lines had been blurred. Another figure, Matthias of Siena. Little is known about him, save for his distinctive signature, a looping M with a diagonal cross. His handwriting appears in at least 9 Templar-related documents across Italy. But what's strange isn't just the volume, it's the continuity. In each transcript, certain phrasing remains constant, bound by faith and office, compelled in spirit, but not in truth, told to say. These are not standard inquisitorial phrases. They're signals, quiet protests, or quiet shields. In a scroll recovered from the Montfaucon ruins, an unnamed scribe notes, "This was spoken under fear." The line is tucked between legal formulae, nearly invisible, yet it speaks volumes. It tells you that even as the machinery of prosecution rolled on, some within, it tried to leave breadcrumbs. Not resistance exactly, but witness. Others went further. The monastery of Figeac preserved a collection of Templar inventories, lists of books, relics, tools, and garments seized from commanderies. But hidden in the binding of one ledger, restorers found a sheaf of notes detailing which items were not reported. An astrolabe in brass, a scroll with unchristian diagrams, an Eastern idol of unknown name. These items, the note states, were given to a traveling priest for safekeeping. The note ends with a cryptic phrase, "Truth should not perish with possession." Possession, not confession, not belief. As if knowledge, dangerous, foreign, unprocessed, was the thing most likely to be burned. And yet the scribes didn't all resist. Some leaned in. A cleric named Bernardus, working under Bishop Guillaume of Paris, was known for stylizing testimonies to fit the proper rhythm of repentance. His records often feature ornate language, transforming plain speech into dramatic contrition. One knight's testimony begins simply, "I was told to spit," but Bernardus renders it, "I wept as I denied him thrice, as Peter once did, fearing my flesh would fail." Poetic. And entirely fabricated, but compelling. Very compelling. This blending of editorial flair with spiritual narrative served a purpose. It made the confessions more persuasive not to the accused, but to the audience, to those who would later read the scrolls and nod solemnly, believing they saw evidence of sin rather than the storytelling of state-sanctioned guilt. That's what the archive was in many places, not just a repository of truth, but of curated memory. A monastery in Navarre, for example, maintained two ledgers, one official, one private. The official followed the party line. The private didn't. It recorded doubts, contradictions, testimonies that didn't align. Over time, both ledgers grew sometimes in tandem, sometimes in conflict. In 1703, a Jesuit scholar reviewing the pair wrote, "It is as if the truth stood next to a mirror, and we must guess which is which." And guess we must. Because in many cases, the scribes who dared preserve conflicting truths were cautious enough to remain anonymous, their marginalia unsigned, their edits subtle, their rebellion quiet, but not invisible. Every time a Templar confession ends mid-sentence, every time a name is crossed out and replaced, every time a translation favors metaphor over clarity, you sense a scribe behind it deciding what would survive. Some did it for duty, some did it for fear, but just a few seem to have done it for posterity, so that someone someday might look back and realize that the record was never neutral, that the archive was a battleground, that truth had to be smuggled in the margins. And here you are now, centuries later, following the trail. You began with papal letters with kings and grandmasters, but now you sit with the architects of the archive, the ones who inked our collective memory stroke by careful stroke. And in their silence, in their tiny annotations, you begin to hear a different kind of confession, not of sin, but of complicity. At first you almost miss it. A faint crescent scratched delicately into the corner of a parchment. It's not inked, just indented. You angle the page toward the light and it catches the groove. Just a crescent. No explanation, no context. But then you find it again, on another document. Different scribe, different location, same crescent, and then again. And that's when it begins, this slow unraveling of a thread hidden not in words, but in symbols. Tiny, marginal, and often invisible unless you're looking. The Templar archives are often treated as purely textual, interrogation records, ledgers, letters. But scribes, especially those with monastic training, did more than write. They marked, they encoded, and some of those marks don't quite fit the traditional grammar of the page. A leaf-shaped flourish beside a knight's name, a double-cross stroke beneath a date, a sequence of dots along the edge of a line that doesn't need embellishment. Harmless scribal quirks. Perhaps. Or perhaps a language within the language. Paleographers call these sigla shorthand signs used by scribes to save time or note significance. But some of the sigla in Templar-related documents don't match any known shorthand system. One Vatican archivist back in the 1950s cataloged over a dozen recurring symbols found only in records related to the trials. None appear in unrelated church texts from the same period. Take the double square. It shows up on at least 7 French testimonies, always at the top right corner, never explained. In one, it sits beside a sentence later redacted. In another, it appears beside a name crossed out in red. The pattern suggests it wasn't decorative, it was directive. Maybe a code for review, or deletion, or doubt. Then there's the circle and slash carved rather than drawn, usually near mentions of absolution or secrecy. In one extraordinary case, it appears next to the Pope's own comment on the chignon parchment. Almost like a footnote of dissent, but it's unsigned, unexplained, anonymous, which is in itself telling, because scribes weren't supposed to editorialize. Their job was fidelity, precision, silence. But human hands, even when obedient, sometimes hesitate. And in those hesitations, those secret marks, you find the whisper of agency. One document in Avignon includes a confession with a marginal X beside the line, "I worshipped a head." But not just any X, it's drawn over the word worshipped, and then in minuscule script, someone has added or was said to. That's not copy error. That's a correction, or a protest, or a plea. In the Salamanca archives, another twist emerges. A Templar charter unrelated to the trials includes a geometric spiral in the margin, beside a passage on relics. When analyzed under ultraviolet light, a second spiral appears smaller, layered into the ink's iron content. Invisible to the naked eye. Someone, it seems, embedded meaning beneath the text itself. A scholar in 1991 suggested these marks formed a kind of symbolic descent network, a way for scribes and clerks to communicate beneath the official line, flagging inconsistencies, objections, or doubts. It's an unproven theory, but compelling. Because once you start seeing the symbols, you can't unsee them. And it's not just visual. Certain phrases repeat in unusual places. Under compulsion, he spoke as he must. Or the tongue moves quicker than the soul. These aren't standard legalisms. They're literary, poetic, and they often appear in documents with the same recurring marks. A kind of code, maybe. Not to hide the truth, but to keep it breathing. You recall Matthias of Siena with his looping M. His documents bear 3 such symbols, always near lines of coercion. And that faint crescent, you've now found it in French, Italian, and Aragonese records. Different hands, same curve. So what does it mean? No one knows for sure. But the repetition suggests something shared. A culture perhaps among scribes and archivists who were not fully at ease with what they were asked to record. Men of faith, yes, but also of conscience. And when the system demanded silence, they left symbols instead. A curved leaf in Rome, a triple dot in Toulouse, a faded star in Cyprus, tiny rebellions. And not all symbols were critical. Some appear to protect. In the margins of a Florence transcript, a tiny fish is drawn, an old Christian sign, sure, but its placement is curious, beside a knight's claim of innocence. It's the only mark on the page. Quiet, almost tender. Others seem to catalog memory. A faint labyrinth pattern, a mirrored numeral, a double-blind loop beneath a confession. You wonder, was this how a community of record-keepers encoded what they could not say aloud? A network of silent witnesses preserving ambiguity in a system that demanded certainty. Maybe. Or maybe it's all coincidence. Maybe we're reading too much into what is, in truth, nothing more than the idle doodles of bored scribes. But even that theory falters when you return to a document from Rouen, a confession signed, sealed, and witnessed. Everything seems in order, until you flip it and notice something curious. On the back, scrawled in faded ink, are 4 words I did not believe. No name, no explanation, just that. You sit with that line for a long time, because in the end, what these symbols tell us isn't just about what happened, but how people lived inside the happening. How they navigated a system of fear. How they carved truth, not loudly, but carefully beneath the surface, beneath the line. They couldn't stop the trials. They couldn't save the order, but they could leave a mark. And centuries later, here you are, tracing crescents and spirals in quiet defiance, reading not just the archive, but the margins of history. You unfold the map gently. It's been handled too many times, each crease a scar, each faded line a whisper from another age. The parchment smells of dust and salt, its corners nibbled by centuries of air and fingers. At first glance, it looks like any other medieval chart. A scattering of islands, wavy coastlines, compass roses turning like flowers in the sea. But then you see it. A coastline that shouldn't be there. Specifically, the eastern shore of South America drawn with alarming accuracy. A full century before anyone in Europe officially discovered it. The map is known as the Carta di Sabatier, and it's one of the strangest artifacts connected, however loosely, to the Knights Templar. Recovered from the archives of a private Italian library in the 1800s, it has no date, no author, and no accompanying letter. But in the lower left corner, there's a faint watermark, a cross within a circle uncannily similar to the known seal of the Templar commandery of La Rochelle. Now, La Rochelle was no ordinary port. It was the Templars' primary Atlantic base in France, a departure point for trade, for transport, and according to some, for escape. When the arrests began in 1307, this is where some believe the ships left from. Where they sailed is another matter entirely. Official history tells us the Templars never crossed the Atlantic, that they disappeared into trial records and legends. But the map you hold seems to disagree. It shows rivers, mountains, a rough but recognizable outline of Brazil's coast. Not a fantasy island or mythical Terra Australis, but a continent, a real one. And it's not alone. A 14th century Portolan chart found in Majorca, undated, unsigned, also shows land far to the west of the Azores. The contours are vague, but again unmistakably continental. And in both cases, tucked into the margins in pale archaic Latin, are strange notations. One translates loosely to lands reached by the bearded knights in white. Who were they? Some say the maps were forged, later retroactively planted to stir controversy. But analysis of the ink and parchment dates them to the early 1300s, before Columbus, before Cabot, before even the Norse rediscovery of Vinland was widely known. And again, the Templar watermark appears. Subtle, but there. Of course, maps are not proof. Anyone could have guessed at lands across the sea. The idea of Western continents was not unknown to classical geographers, but the detail is what baffles researchers. These aren't vague blobs, they show inlets and promontories that modern cartographers didn't confirm until centuries later. So how would the Templars have known one possibility they didn't? But perhaps they carried maps from others. The order had deep ties with Arabic scholars whose knowledge of astronomy, navigation, and geography far surpassed much of Europe's. If Islamic sailors or even Phoenician traditions preserved in Levantine ports had reached the Americas, the Templars might have acquired fragments of that lore, copied them, guarded them, or maybe, as some suggest, they went themselves. There's a half-buried legend in Breton folklore of a white fleet that vanished westward, never to return. Another in Galicia tells of knights who returned with seeds that didn't match anything native, maize perhaps, or cacao. No solid proof, just echoes. But what makes the map more mysterious is the note on its reverse, not for translation, only for the East Gate. The phrase is odd. It doesn't refer to any known geographic term. Some scholars believe East Gate was a code name, a signal to fellow Templars about a direction or portal of knowledge. And it gets stranger. The same phrase appears in a Templar inventory from Portugal I chart of the East Gate, to be held until the Feast of the Magdalene. Why a specific feast day? Why that phrasing? It suggests ritual, timing, maybe even secrecy beyond secrecy. Portugal, as it happens, became a haven for former Templars after their suppression. The Order of Christ, which many believe inherited, Templar members played a central role in Portuguese exploration. Prince Henry, the navigator, the architect of the Age of Discovery, was its grand master. And guess where he built his naval base, Sagres, the far western tip of Europe? where the sea whispers the loudest, where you face the open Atlantic and wonder what lies beyond. It all starts to form a shape, not a conclusion, but a question shaped like a map. What if the Templars were the custodians of forgotten geographies? What if their archives included not gold, but directions? And if that's true, then maybe their treasure wasn't hoarded. Maybe it was sailed away. You think again of La Rochelle, of ships quietly slipping away as the arrests loomed. No cries, no resistance, just disappearance, vanishment with intent. And of course, none of this can be proven. The maps could be misread, the watermarks misinterpreted, the notations coincidence. But when so many fragments point to the same improbable suggestion, you begin to wonder. Not did they sail west, but what did they know before anyone else did? Because history favors those who write it, and if the Templars were writing in maps, in code, in guarded circles of secrecy, then maybe they left us more than myth. They left us a question, a line drawn across the sea, daring us to follow. The trail takes you far from Europe now, beyond the cathedrals and castles, beyond the French courtyards and inquisitorial halls. You find yourself standing beneath a crescent moon in the faded heart of Anatolia. The call to prayer rises in the distance, and the air smells of spice and dust, and something older, something faintly metallic, like the ghosts of chainmail long since rusted away. Because if the Templars truly vanished, the East is where many believe they may have gone. The Ottoman Empire, still rising in the 14th century, was not yet the juggernaut it would become. The Byzantines, meanwhile, were clinging to the bones of their former grandeur, and between them, pathways, ports, and places forgotten by the empires, but not by history. It is in these liminal spaces, coastal enclaves, mountain passes, old crusader outposts that the echoes begin. A monastic report from Thessaloniki in 1322 speaks of men from the west, disciplined in battle, who serve no banner but wear white. Another from a Persian merchant's diary mentions Latins residing in a fortress near the Cilician border, where they maintained a strict code and paid in silver stamped with a faded cross. He writes, "They spoke few words, but knew our stars." This phrase, "knew our stars," turns up again. In a set of Byzantine naval records, ships passing through roads in the early 1300s were boarded by men described as unaffiliated knights, bearing neither the cross of the Hospitallers nor the emblems of the empire. They asked not for goods, but for charts. Specifically, charts of wind patterns in the Indian Ocean. You remember from earlier sections, the Templars were collectors of knowledge. And perhaps that's what they were doing here, not conquering, not hiding, but listening. There's a legend told among the dervishes of Konya. It speaks of white spirits with fire-forged swords who visited their lodge in the time of Sultan Orhan. The tale is wrapped in mysticism, but curiously detailed in one respect. The visitors brought a gift. A box of scrolls sealed with wax and bound with iron thread. The dervishes said it contained the map of the soul's journey. Likely metaphor, yes, but even metaphors have roots. In Ottoman archives, a captured letter, poorly preserved, mentions a group of Frankish knights offering their services to the court of Bursa in exchange for passage to the garden at the edge of the sea. The term is unusual. Some interpret it as poetic code for India. Others whisper it referred to a place even further east. Perhaps the strangest trace comes from a fragment discovered in a Syriac monastery near Lake Van. It's not a full manuscript, just a page badly faded, but bearing a list. Names, Latin names. Next to each, the Syriac equivalent, and beside that, a set of numbers, coordinates, and a note reading simply, "They arrived on the day the stars crossed." Could these have been Templars adopting local customs, re-identifying themselves in new languages, new worlds? It's hard to say, but the pattern is oddly consistent. Wherever records grow thin, they begin to echo. A Western name in an Eastern list. A coat of arms etched into a caravanserai door. A whisper in a language not native to the place it's found. Of course, one must tread carefully here. The East is rich with tales, and history has a habit of absorbing the unfamiliar into local myth. But not all evidence is anecdotal. In the Topkapi Palace Library, among the oldest maps of trade routes and pilgrimage paths, there's a symbol that doesn't match Ottoman or Arab designs. It's a variation of the Templar cross, tilted, stylized, but recognizable. The chart itself references a Brotherhood of the Flame located near the Zagros Mountains, providing safe passage and honest trade. No known Islamic order claimed that name, which leads you to wonder, did the Templars fragment? Yes, but also adapt? Did some of them, rather than fleeing west, go east, not as conquerors or exiles, but as travelers seeking continuity? Perhaps their mission outlived their order. Perhaps their need for secrecy became a habit rather than a strategy. And perhaps they chose not to rebuild, but to integrate. We know that by the 15th century, the memory of the Templars had faded from the East. Their name held no meaning for most. But their pattern, this shape of silent movement, of guarded knowledge of loyal brotherhoods, who spoke little and traded in ideas, seems eerily preserved. And then there are the stone marks. In a ruin near Antioch, carved into the wall of an old way station, a set of concentric rings with 8 spokes. A design not unlike the Wheel of Time or the seal of certain esoteric Templar groups whispered about in 19th century occult circles. Could this be coincidence? Possibly. But then there's the second mark near Mosul, and the third half submerged in a former Crusader fortress, now inhabited by shepherds, where a circle encloses a chalice and a star with 5 points rests beside it. And suddenly symbols in stone begin to look less decorative. They look like breadcrumbs. The East may not have been a sanctuary for the order as a whole, but for those few who escaped with knowledge, with secrets, with convictions intact, it might have been the one place they could keep moving, unnoticed, unburdened, and undisturbed. You breathe the desert air. You feel the silence stretching across centuries, and you listen to the echoes of men who did not vanish. They just shifted direction. You walk through a narrow, vaulted chamber. The stones are ancient, but not European. There are no stained glass windows, no flying buttresses, just worn sandstone and a curious hollow stillness. On one wall, a symbol is etched, weathered but familiar, a pair of outstretched wings flanking a disc. Egyptian, Mesopotamian. It's hard to say. What is clear, though, is that the architecture hums with purpose. Not just structure, but ceremony. And as your eyes adjust, you begin to sense it, the strange overlap between here and a chapel you visited weeks earlier, one that once belonged to the Knights Templar. 2 temples, 2 continents, and yet, something connects them. Ritual. There's a theory, obscure, often dismissed, but persistent, that the Templars inherited not only relics and real estate in the Holy Land, but also ritual forms far older than Christianity, that in the dusty corners of Jerusalem's sacred sites, the Knights discovered not just history, but patterns, rites, symbols, and architectural blueprints that predated them by millennia. And perhaps they quietly absorbed them. Start with the layout. Several Templar chapels, particularly in Portugal and southern France, deviate from the standard Latin cross design. Instead, they're circular or octagonal layouts more common to Islamic architecture, and before that to pagan sanctuaries. The most famous example is the corolla in Tomar, Portugal, a central plan supported by columns wrapped in ambulatory space for ritual movement. Almost identical in proportion to the Dome of the Rock, once Templar headquarters. Coincidence or architectural memory? But it's not just shape, it's action. Templar initiation rites, though largely undocumented and often exaggerated by their enemies, reportedly involved a series of ritual denials, symbolic gestures, and movement in darkness. The descriptions are tantalizingly vague: a kiss, a touch, a whispered word. Critics called it heresy. But ritual scholars see something else: echoes of ancient mystery cults. The Eleusinian rites, the Mithraic grades, even early Hermetic initiation. There's an account from the Inquisition that describes a Templar chapel where no light was allowed save a single torch. Another describes a black cloth draped over a column and questions asked in a language unknown. The Church interpreted this as blasphemy. But the language, possibly Coptic, possibly Syriac, possibly a tongue preserved from older initiatory practices passed along not as doctrine but as form. And what of the symbols? The Templars used the cross patee, yes. But there are other marks more ambiguous. A double-headed eagle, a seven-pointed star, a serpent consuming its tail, the Ouroboros. These turn up in Middle Eastern Gnostic and pre-Christian traditions. One appears carved into a keystone above a Templar doorway in southern Italy. Another is found in the ruins of a temple near Palmyra. In one manuscript, partially damaged, stored in the archive of Toledo, a diagram links the Templar cross to a Sumerian wheel of time. The lines connect with mathematical precision, too precise, some argue, to be accidental. Which brings you to a more radical question: did the Templars knowingly or not preserve fragments of spiritual systems older than Christianity systems, buried by empire and rebranded by doctrine? It's not a new idea. Renaissance thinkers flirted with it. 19th-century mystics obsessed over it. And modern historians, though cautious, concede one possibility: the Templars were exposed to immense cultural crossover in the Holy Land. They met Sufis, Gnostics, Jews, Nestorians, Zoroastrians. And in a world where salvation was debated in 12 languages, they may have begun to see faith not as a straight road, but a mosaic. A Templar scroll from Cyprus dated 1293 contains a prayer that blends Christian and Islamic motifs. It refers to the light that speaks in silence and ends with a line: "As Abraham bowed to the unknown, so do we." The Church would never have sanctioned such wording. But there it is in Templar hands. Even their reverence for John the Baptist, curiously emphasized in some regional commanderies, has older resonances. John the Baptizer, the liminal prophet. A figure associated with the threshold between old and new. He appears in Mandaean texts, Gnostic scrolls, and Islamic teachings, all overlapping in themes of purification, secrecy, and transmission of knowledge. So maybe the Templars didn't just fight in the East. Maybe they learned from it. And maybe what they brought back wasn't gold or relics, but patterns of thought, blueprints of ritual, concepts that stretched far beyond papal comprehension, which may explain the paranoia. To the Church, ritual was control. Deviations were threat. And if the Templars began to operate with forms no longer entirely Christian, or worse, too universal, then perhaps they weren't just a military threat. They were a spiritual one. Imagine a brotherhood that no longer saw truth as monolithic, one that believed symbols could hold meanings across cultures, that initiation could unlock not loyalty to Rome, but to something deeper, older, more difficult to contain. No wonder they were feared, and no wonder they were erased. But here in these hidden correspondences, in this strange architectural rhyming, you see the faint outline of that other truth, a lineage not of dogma, but of design, a knowledge of temples passed from hand to hand, built again in stone and silence. They did not create it, but they remembered it. And now perhaps so do you. The monastery was small, tucked high into the hills near the Loire Valley, an unremarkable structure by medieval standards. But inside, there was once a room lined wall to wall with shelves, a scriptorium where monks spent their lives in ink and silence. They copied scrolls, catalogued letters, preserved histories. Then, in 1327, it vanished. Not the building, the records. Gone. No fire, no flood. No mention in royal orders or papal decrees. One day, 100 manuscripts existed. The next, a polite note in the monastery's annual inventory. This year, the scriptorium was found bare. No explanation. You sit with that phrase for a while. Found bare. As if the pages themselves got up and walked away. Of course, scriptoriums were not eternal. Books decayed, monks aged, priorities shifted. But here's what makes this case unusual. This particular scriptorium had long been known to house Templar material. Letters from commanderies, trial transcripts, even a partial register of oaths, an exceedingly rare item thought to be used for internal tracking of knightly vows. Its existence was confirmed in a visitation report from 1318. The inspector noted that several volumes of Templar origin remain, though their use is now forbidden. He describes seals, marginal notes. One book even bore a notation that it was not to be shown to any outside the circle. And then, 9 years later, nothing. Not burned, not looted, not transferred, just disappeared. This wasn't an isolated incident. A Carmelite priory in Normandy reported in the same decade the sudden loss of Eastern materials, including a set of scrolls, believed to have come from the Templar outpost in Acre before its fall. Again, no sign of violence. Just absence. And in the Abbey of Saint-Benoît, an inventory from 1331 lists a tome of the crossed knights in the possession of the abbot. 4 years later, in the next annual list, no mention. And when asked by the bishop's agent, the abbot simply said, "It is no longer necessary." No longer necessary. The phrase chills you more than any torch or blade, because it implies decision, choice. A quiet erasure made not out of fear, but out of design. What happened in those missing years? One theory suggests internal purges, that as the political climate shifted, church officials feared a resurgence of Templar loyalty among sympathetic monks and ordered the silent destruction of remaining documents. Another theory points toward the early consolidation of inquisitorial archives material gathered, sifted, and buried in central vaults for safekeeping. Buried so deep in some cases, they've never surfaced again. But there's a third possibility, that the scribes themselves took the texts. Imagine it. A young monk, perhaps once trained by a Templar chaplain, overhears whispers. An order is coming. The shelves are to be cleared. He waits until night gathers the scrolls, wraps them in oilskin, and hides them in the root cellar. Or carries them over weeks to a sympathetic house across the valley. Maybe he buries them. Maybe he burns them. Maybe he copies them first. There's no proof of this, of course. But one surviving letter hints at such a moment. It's unsigned, undated, written in the cramped hand of someone clearly unused to speed. The ink blots. The Latin is rushed. But the message is clear: they will take what we do not hide. I have wrapped the oaths in cloth and sent them to the West. What oaths, where in the West, the letter never says. But nearby in the margins, someone has drawn a cross, not the standard Latin form, but a modified variant. A looped cross, similar to ones seen in Templar graffiti found in Portugal and southern England. A personal mark, perhaps. A farewell. Even centuries later, the trail refuses to vanish entirely. In 1802, a farmer outside Tours uncovered a clay jar beneath a crumbled wall. Inside, fragments of parchment so fragile they disintegrated in air. But one scholar managed to transcribe a phrase before the letters vanished. The light remains in the silence. You can almost see it. A last gesture. Someone placing the jar in earth, pressing it down with care, sealing it not with fear, but with hope. Because if the scriptorium disappeared, maybe it didn't die. Maybe it moved. We often imagine knowledge as stationary, kept in rooms, copied in stillness. But the truth is, knowledge migrates. It hides. It survives. And sometimes it disappears, because that's the only way it can be safe. Even today, church archives contain locked collections, not sealed by damage or decay, but by choice. Dozens of Templar-related documents are known to exist only by their catalog entries. Titles with no pages, boxes with no access. Occasionally, a scholar stumbles upon a page or two, but the deeper content remains in shadow. Some say it's bureaucracy, others say it's fear. Because the question isn't just what the Templars knew, it's what others believed they knew. A power not in weapons, but in words. And if those words still exist, if they live in a forgotten cellar, a mislabeled shelf, or a fireproof vault, then maybe the scriptorium didn't vanish. Maybe it just turned invisible. You step back from the thought. The silence of empty shelves. The blank space in the archive. And in that silence, a message waits. The cover is nondescript, aged leather cracked at the spine, bound with a clasp that no longer latches. There is no title, no emblem, just the quiet weight of something not meant to be read by anyone except the hand that wrote it. And yet, here it is. Hidden inside the lining of an old trunk discovered in a Burgundian cellar, misfiled among wine inventories and receipts for sheep. The diary of Bertrand de Martel, Grand Prior of Auvergne, one of the highest-ranking Templars in France at the time of the arrests. No one knows how it survived. The document begins without preamble. No dear journal, no date. Just a sentence I will write, what I dare not speak. You feel the tone immediately tense inward, as if each word costs him. This is not a record of public events. It is a confession, but not the kind demanded by inquisitors. He describes the autumn of 1307 in cold, surgical fragments. The knock at the preceptory gate, the sealed warrant, the look on his brethren's faces as they were shackled without resistance. He writes not of surprise, but of inevitability. We had long known we would be betrayed, only not when, not by whom. He does not name names directly, never Philip or Clement, only the crown and the robe, but his meaning is clear. What's more striking is his reaction, not anger, not even grief, but exhaustion. We were never meant to last. The fire was too bright and the room too small. Then, on the 6th page, a shift. He begins to describe a set of papers, stored beneath the altar of the chapel at Montferrand, bound in red leather sealed with wax. He calls them the Concords. What were they? From his notes, it seems they were internal documents, an attempt by senior Templars to unify their understanding of certain truths acquired in the East. He refers to divergent revelations, conflicts between tradition and discovery, and the need to preserve without igniting the Church. It reads like the minutes of a secret council. And what's more, he admits, we did not all agree. Some believed the Concords should be burned. Others believed they were the purpose of our survival. He never describes the contents directly. Just fragments, the measures of the stars, the stones that speak the name of the fire, and that which was written before Babel. You stare at those words. They sound absurd, mystical. maybe even fabricated. But then you remember Bertrand de Martel was not a fantasist. He was an administrator, a realist, a man tasked with managing farms, rents knights, and commanderies across hundreds of miles. And yet here he is pouring ink into the margins of his exile to preserve something he could never say aloud. He writes of dreams, of voices, of a night in Acre when a stranger with no face and 7 names gave him a piece of flint and said, "This is your beginning." Again, poetic, symbolic, or a record of an actual cryptic encounter. The line between spiritual and real in these pages is porous. And then perhaps most revealing comes a list. Short, stark, 6 entries, written in a hand more rigid than the rest, as if copied from elsewhere. 1. The seal must be broken only at dawn. 2. The circle must never touch the cross. 3. He who drinks first must not speak. 4. The stars of the east guide the final gate. 5. The name is not to be written. 6. If the fire returns, bury the eye. You read them again and again, and each time they seem to mean something different. Liturgical rules. Codes warnings. None of them make obvious sense, but taken together they suggest a structure, a rite, a thing rehearsed in silence. And just when you think you've reached the heart of the mystery, the entries stop. The remaining pages are blank, or rather were blank, because under ultraviolet light, archivists in 1997 discovered faint writing in what was likely lemon juice or another organic ink, invisible to the naked eye. Across 5 pages, Bertrand wrote a second layer to his diary, a postscript only readable if one knew to look. It is there that he describes the departure, not of himself, but of others. The brothers who carried the Concords beyond the sea. No names, no destination. Just this they left before the harvest. 2 by land, 4 by ship. The one who could read the fire stayed behind. And then a final line. If you are reading this, it means the circle has opened again. You close the diary slowly. The leather is warm from your hands. The air feels thinner somehow, as if you've stepped through a veil. Not into certainty, but into deeper ambiguity. Because now the question isn't what Bertrand knew. It's whether the trail he left was meant to be found at all, or whether it was a signal cast across centuries like a bottle into the tide. For anyone who might still understand. The scroll is short, barely the length of your forearm, and so tightly rolled it crackles when you begin to uncoil it. The parchment is stiff from age, stained with water and marked with travel. It smells faintly of clove and dust. At the top, in an uneven Latin hand, is the name Hugo de Aragon, knight and servant in Christ's pilgrimage. Nothing remarkable at first glance. Just another Templar who, like many others, undertook a late-life pilgrimage after the order's fall. But as you read, something shifts. Hugo does not describe the usual path to Santiago or Rome. He writes instead of strange borderlands of meeting brothers who wear no cross, but guard the gate of passing through a region called Vallis Lucis, Valley of Light, a name not known on any map. And then there's the code. Midway through the scroll, Hugo's tone changes. The narrative fragments. Words become single lines, odd spellings, repetitions. A pattern that makes no sense until you begin to track the frequency of letters and the positioning of the phrases. You realize it's a cipher, not a decorative one, a deliberate one. This isn't a prayer, it's a key. Scholars who've studied Hugo's scroll believe it's written in a blend of early Latin shorthand Arabic abjad numerals and a templated substitution system used in Levantine trade ciphers, which means Hugo wasn't just a pilgrim. He was a courier, or something more. You remember from earlier, Bertrand de Martel's diary mentioned the brothers who carried the Concords beyond the sea. Hugo may have been one of them, or at least in contact with those who were. And then you find the clincher. In the ciphered portion, when decoded, is a phrase that translates roughly to "the ink is hidden in salt. The voice is hidden in dust." It echoes a line from the Syriac fragment found in Lake Van. The phrasing, though separated by distance and language, is unmistakably familiar. Two Templar-linked texts, both referencing concealment through elemental metaphor. Not just a poetic flourish, this is language designed to guide someone who already knows what to look for. Further along the scroll, Hugo describes arriving at a coastal fortress, its name erased by damage, where he's welcomed by men who knew the right of silence. He writes, "We sat in the wind while the stars shifted." One by one, the old names were spoken again. The old names. Possibly the same names recorded in the lost scriptorium. Possibly those whispered during the initiation rites hinted at in previous chapters. Possibly code names for the few who continued the work in secret. Hugo also writes of carrying two pieces. That's all he calls them. No elaboration. But he does note one was too bright for ink. One too curved for script. What kind of pieces? If you return to Bertrand's diary, one of the conquered entries refers to that which bends light but holds none, a curious turn of phrase often dismissed as metaphor. But Hugo's scroll suggests otherwise. Perhaps the pieces were not written texts, but objects, artifacts so strange or sensitive they could only be described in symbol. And then he describes a ritual. Not in detail, he's careful, but he mentions a bowl carved of 7 layers placed beneath a cedar tree during the new moon. A name was whispered into it. Then the bowl was buried. This matches almost exactly an initiation rite from a Coptic manuscript recovered in Egypt, a ceremony involving a layered vessel silence and a spoken name. Again, the overlaps are too specific to ignore. What emerges is a picture of movement. Templars or former Templars didn't just scatter in exile. Some carried instructions. Knowledge encoded in scrolls, buried in story, hidden in ritual. They passed this information along obscure routes from Aragon to Rhodes, from Antioch to Portugal. Not a grand conspiracy, not a network of power, but a kind of relay. Each carrier passing the flame to the next, never seeing the full picture. And Hugo may have been one of the final links. His scroll ends abruptly. The final words are uneven, as if written quickly. The salt is gone. The dust now speaks only to the wind. No signature, no farewell. But at the bottom corner, pressed lightly into the parchment, is a symbol, a crescent surrounding a cross. Not the typical Templar design, but a known variant used in Aragon during the late Crusades. And here's the strange part. The same symbol appears in a 20th century excavation report from Malta, carved into a stone fragment, discovered beneath the crypt of a former Templar chapel. The carving was dismissed at the time as decorative. But now you wonder, could it be the mark of the couriers, a way to signal safe passage like the chalk symbols left by travelers on monastery doors? If so, Hugo left more than a scroll. He left a map coded not in directions but in symbols, a map of transmission, memory, and message. The Pilgrim's Code, then, is not one key but many. Not a solution, but a shape. A way of understanding the flow of Templar knowledge, not as static, stored in vaults, but alive, moving across generations, hiding in plain sight. And maybe, just maybe, it still moves. Through old books, strange glyphs, whispered names. You roll the scroll back up gently, carefully. The ink may have faded, but the message hasn't. Not for those who still know how to listen. Beneath the blazing Mediterranean sun, Malta seems immutable, solid stone and salt wind. The city of Valletta rises like a fortress from the sea, all golden limestone and sharp angles. But deep below its streets, beneath centuries of Crusader architecture, lies a vault few have entered and a fewer remember. You descend in near darkness. The staircase twists. Dust stirs. The air turns cool, then cold. Your steps echo as if stepping into the bones of the island, and then vaulted stone arched like the ribs of a sleeping beast. This is the undercroft of a 13th century commandery, once Templar, later repurposed by the Hospitallers after the Templar arrests. For years, it was ignored, assumed to be little more than a storage chamber. But in 1972, a team of local archaeologists was granted access as part of a routine structural survey. The goal was mundane: assess stability, record minor findings, check for water damage. Instead, they found something else. The team, led by a historian named Dr. Eliseo Barone, uncovered a hidden subchamber beneath the southern wall. The entrance was sealed with rubble and loose mortar, but unmistakably artificial. When cleared, it revealed a narrow corridor barely wide enough for one person at a time, leading into a hexagonal room unlike anything in known Templar architecture. The walls were bare stone save for a shallow recess on each side, 6 in total. In 5 of the niches they found fragments, bits of wax, burnt cloth, and what appeared to be the shattered handle of a ceremonial dagger. In the 6th, nothing. But it wasn't what they found that caused the project's abrupt halt. It was what they felt. Multiple members of the excavation team later reported an overwhelming sense of pressure inside the chamber. Not heat or suffocation, but a weight as if the walls leaned inward. Equipment failed. Lights flickered. One archaeologist refused to return after the second day, citing a dream in which the floor opened, and a voice said, "Not yours." Of course, that sounds dramatic, superstitious even, until you read the interim report submitted before the dig was shut down. In it, Dr. Barone mentions discovering an engraving of unfamiliar script on the ceiling of the hexagonal room. He describes it as consisting of looping arcs and intersecting lines, possibly Templar shorthand, possibly a pre-existing symbol repurposed by the order. The report includes a sketch, a circle enclosed by 2 broken lines with a star offset to the right. The central image, a single vertical eye. You've seen that symbol before. In a Templar trial record from Toulouse, one of the accused knights is asked about the sign of the open eye. He refuses to answer. The record notes he grew pale and would not speak further. But the most troubling part comes in Barone's handwritten field notes, never published, but obtained decades later by an independent researcher. In them he writes, there was something in the wall behind the empty niche. Hollow space. Sounded like a chamber. He requested permission to open it. 2 days later, the dig was stopped. Officially, it was a budget issue. Unofficially, the site was reclassified by the Maltese government and sealed. All documents were moved to restricted storage. Barone never spoke publicly again. You begin to see the pattern. From the vanished scriptorium to Bertrand's hidden diary, from Hugo's ciphered scroll to Malta's sealed vault, this is not one erasure. It is many. Independent actions scattered across time and territory, all pointing toward the same conclusion. There is something in the Templar record that someone, perhaps many someones, do not want rediscovered. What was in the chamber? A reliquary, a scroll, a map, or something far stranger. Something tied to the concords, to the pieces carried west, to the rites too dangerous to record plainly. Consider this: Malta was the final stronghold of the Hospitallers, the order that inherited much of the Templars' property. But there are whispers, long denied, that the transfer was not just logistical, but spiritual. That certain rituals were passed along with the deeds. that a select few within the Hospitallers were chosen to carry the deeper tradition. It would explain why the chamber was built beneath a property that changed hands but not function, and it would explain the curious gap in the commandery's 14th century records. One moment routine repairs are listed, the next silence, an entire year blank. Back in the hexagonal chamber, the niches still sit in darkness. What was burned, what was broken, what was never placed in the 6th, we may never know. But one phrase from Baron's notes stays with you. If this is ritual, then it is older than Malta, older than the Order, a thing repurposed like a stage awaiting actors who know the lines by memory. That sounds like something Bertrand would have written, or Hugo, or any of the others who left only fragments like shattered glass reflecting a single flame. You climb back into the light heart heavy with questions. If the vault remains sealed, it is not because of what it contains, but because of what it might confirm. That the Templars were more than knights, more than bankers, that they may have been at their very core keepers. It begins with a stone, weathered, embedded in a hillside in Newport, Rhode Island. Locals call it the Old Tower. Officially, it's a colonial windmill, nothing more. But something about it feels off. The arches are wrong, the masonry too old. Beneath layers of later repairs, the core construction seems to defy its supposed 17th century origin. Then comes the theory dismissed by academics, clung to by amateurs, that this isn't just some quirky windmill, that it's older, medieval, that it was built by men who came not for conquest or settlement, but to leave a mark. Templars. Of course, the idea seems outlandish. What possible reason would a 14th century knight have to cross the Atlantic centuries before Columbus? What ship? What purpose? But dig deeper, and the theory begins to gain shape. First, the structure itself. Archaeological analysis has confirmed that the mortar in the tower's core differs from later colonial mixtures. The window placements align to solstice points, not utility. And then there's the legend passed down in New England folklore of the White Cross men who once visited the shore, traded silver with the locals, and left before the snow came. Fanciful likely, but not without echoes elsewhere. In the mid-1800s, a carved stone was uncovered in Westford, Massachusetts. It depicts a sword, a shield, and a helmet with a cross-shaped emblem. The carving is rough but strangely deliberate. Beneath it is an inscription eroded nearly to nothing, interpreted by some as M. Sinclair, 1398. The name matters. Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, was a known associate of the remaining Templar networks in Scotland. After the Order's fall, many knights found refuge in northern strongholds, safe from French and papal interference. Sinclair himself was reputed to have funded exploratory voyages westward. His descendant, William Sinclair, would go on to build Rosslyn Chapel, famed for its strange non-Christian motifs and rumored secret vaults. So the idea of a Sinclair-led voyage to a new land, possibly carrying survivors' knowledge or relics, has captivated theorists for decades. And then there's the map. In 1957, a Norse-inspired document known as the Zano map resurfaced. It shows parts of Greenland and a mysterious landmass to the west, before those regions were officially charted. Critics call it a forgery. But one detail stands out: a small cross drawn inland, on what would now be North America, labeled only Templar. Not a city, not a region, a temple, or maybe a signal. Could the Templars have reached the shores of a new world? If so, what were they looking for? Theories abound: a place to escape persecution, a land unclaimed by Rome, a continent where they could preserve the Concords without fear of destruction, or perhaps something more mythical: traces of the antediluvian world knowledge untainted by empire. And here's where it all gets stranger. Among the artifacts recovered from the supposed Templar sites in Nova Scotia and New England, several bear unfamiliar symbols, loops, crossed lines, stars. One matches a glyph seen in Bertrand de Martel's Hidden Diary. Another is nearly identical to a mark pressed into Hugo's scroll. These aren't medieval European characters. They resemble pre-Columbian markings, but not quite. They're hybrid, as if two traditions met and a new language was born. Some say this is fantasy, coincidence, pseudo-history at best. But others argue that if even one Templar knight crossed the Atlantic, whether by Sinclair's hand or another's, then the implications stretch far beyond American shores. It would mean the Concords weren't just hidden, they were transplanted, planted like seeds in soil untouched by papal power. And what might have grown? You imagine a knight cloaked in worn linen kneeling on unfamiliar ground. He carries no banner, no armor, just a book perhaps, or a symbol etched into stone. He buries it carefully, not out of fear, but hope, that one day someone might find it, understand it, continue it. There are reports, quiet ones, of stone chambers in Vermont and Maine bearing inscriptions no one can translate, of burial mounds disturbed and reburied with care, of Jesuit missionaries in the 17th century encountering local tribes who spoke of pale men from the east, who honored the sun but not the cross. And then there's the Rosicrucians. Their first manifestos appear in the early 1600s, filled with allusions to hidden orders, lost temples, and knowledge preserved across the sea. Too late to be Templar, too strange to be Protestant, but perhaps heirs or echoes. The Templar trail in Europe fades by the mid-14th century, but in the New World, it begins again in whispers, symbols, misfit stones. A second life, a new frontier. And maybe that was the plan all along. To escape the control of kings and popes, to build a temple not in stone but in secrecy. You look again at the tower in Rhode Island. Tourists pass by. Children run beneath the arches. No one gives it much thought. But maybe, just maybe, beneath those stones is a foundation older than the colony itself. Laid not by Puritans, but by men whose order had died in Europe and yet lived on in silence. You sit beneath the high ceiling of a Renaissance-era archive in Rome, its cool silence broken only by the gentle turn of ancient parchment. Here in this repository of the Vatican's secret correspondence, a curious envelope appears, filed not with papal bulls or council decrees, but among intercepted letters. Ones never delivered, ones never meant to be seen. The envelope is plain sealed in faded red wax and marked with a symbol, a single diagonal slash, through a circle, an old courier code meaning route altered. Inside a letter written in cipher, eventually broken by scholars who weren't even sure what they were decoding. But the contents, well, that's where the story begins to tremble. The letter is unsigned. Dated 1310. Its language is veiled as if assuming interception, but the meaning, when unwrapped, is unsettlingly direct. It refers to the tribunal at Avignon, the papal seat at the time, and an alternative account of the Templar investigations. The writer claims a duplicate record was created, not of the public confessions which had been extracted under torture, but of earlier depositions taken before the official trials began. Depositions that exonerated the order. And these they were supposed to be delivered to the Pope himself. They never arrived. This intercepted letter suggests that a high-ranking courier, possibly an agent loyal to Philip IV, diverted the documents en route from Poitiers to Avignon. Instead of submission to the papal archivist, they were taken to a secure chamber under royal oversight. In short, the Pope may have based his ruling on false or incomplete information, The consequences are staggering. Because for centuries, Clement V has been painted as a reluctant conspirator, a man who acquiesced to Philip's demands, possibly under duress. But what if he never saw the full testimony? What if the records we now call the Chinon parchment, discovered centuries later in the Vatican's own archive, were submitted, but then removed before they could reach the pontiff? If that happened, then the order's fate wasn't just political. It was manipulated from within the machinery meant to judge it. The letter continues. He believes the decision his own. We believe otherwise. Who is he, the Pope, the Inquisitor, Guillaume de Nogaret? Or perhaps a scribe within the College of Cardinals, someone who tried to raise the alarm, and who is we? It's this last question that leads scholars down a rabbit hole. Because this letter does not come from a bishop or royal messenger. It bears markers more consistent with a clandestine network of couriers, some of whom had Templar ties. A few even bore surnames known from the order's European rolls. What if, in the midst of their dissolution, the Templars still had access to a shadow communication network? Loyal messengers, sympathetic scribes, even rogue monks within the church who believed in the order's innocence. The very fact that this letter exists and was preserved suggests that someone on the receiving end believed it was true, that someone wanted it kept, even if unread. We see signs of similar behavior in other areas. Marginalia in papal registries where scribes note missing entry document relocated, or even in one case record struck, but not lost. That last line has haunted historians for years. What does it mean to be struck but not lost, possibly relocated, hidden, or reclassified under a new title? One archive in Naples contains a volume labeled Matters of Moral Error, Indeterminate Allegiances. It contains pages that at first glance appear random heretical disputes, private correspondence, economic ledgers. But then you notice repeated names, Templar names, rewritten in new contexts, placed where no one would think to look. Back to the Rome Intercept, the final paragraph shifts tone. It seems to address the courier directly. You have done more than interrupt a journey. You have altered the ledger of history. The rest will unfold as it must. Seal the door. Burn the wax. Burn the wax. A reference perhaps to destroying seals to prevent the tracing of correspondence. But what about seal the door, symbolic or literal one story, persists unconfirmed naturally, of a bricked-up chamber beneath the Dominican monastery of San Clemente. Local lore says a tunnel once ran from the Vatican to the monastery, used in times of danger or secrecy. If such a chamber exists, and if it housed diverted correspondence, it would explain the odd interruptions in certain trial records, including days that appear skipped testimonies referenced, but not included. This is where the Templar mystery becomes less about relics and more about record. Because what is history if not the control of memory, and who controls memory if not those who decide what is read and what is sealed? You imagine that courier dusty from the road pausing outside the gates of Avignon with the Pope's letter in hand. He hesitates, reroutes, leaves no trace except this single copy, this intercepted echo of a different outcome that never came. Was he acting under orders? Was he paid? Or did he believe in what he was doing? We'll never know. But one thing is clear, the trial of the Templars was not simply a matter of faith or politics. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Of truth, yes, but more devastatingly, of access to truth. The Rome Intercept is not proof of innocence. It is proof of interference. And that is almost more damning, because interference creates shadows, and shadows breed silence. There's an old superstition among Vatican scribes, beware the final page. It's where truths are tucked away, safe from the eyes of readers who stop too soon. The addendum, often ignored, often misfiled, is where the weight of real history sometimes hides. And in one peculiar case, that final page may change everything. In the year 2001, during a quiet audit of archived ecclesiastical decrees in the Vatican Secret Archive, now called the Apostolic Archive, a preservation assistant discovered something unusual. The document in question was filed under a general heading Conclusiones de Templo, a collection of 14th-century administrative notes related to the disbanding of the Knights Templar. A well-trodden folder handled by countless scholars. Nothing extraordinary. Until the assistant noticed the stitching. A second thinner page had been delicately sewn to the back of the final leaf, almost imperceptible. It bore no title, no signature, just a series of lines in an unfamiliar hand, smoother, more personal, written in Latin, but drifting into poetic metaphor. The team initially dismissed it. A clerical note, a scribe's meditation. But closer examination suggested otherwise. The handwriting bore striking similarities to that of Pope Clement V's, and the contents, they weren't administrative. They were reflective, conflicted, almost remorseful. The addendum begins, "What is absolved in spirit cannot be condemned in blood." A sentence that doesn't appear in any other known papal decree. It continues with phrases that hint at private regret and an awareness of duplicity. "I was shown one road, and I walked another. I heard both sides but spoke only one." No direct mention of Philip IV, no mention of the Chinon parchment. But the tone speaks volumes. It reads like a deathbed confession. Clement died in 1314. The document is dated early that same year, and then comes the strangest passage. "If ever these words are read, let them serve not to absolve me, but to alert the reader. History will believe what is repeated. I say now they were not heretics. They were only inconvenient." That word inconvenient is startling. Not criminal, not doctrinally dangerous. Just a problem, a threat to power, a wrinkle in the seamless robe of papal and royal authority. And here the tone shifts again. "Their knowledge I did not understand. Their silence frightened me more than their speech. What they preserved beyond coin, beyond rite, I feared it would unravel too much." It's hard not to recall the concords mentioned in earlier chapters. The suggestion that the Templars guarded not just gold or relics, but ideas, ways of thinking, perhaps even records from the East that challenged the Western view of divine order. Clement's final words on the page, "I left the window open. I pray that the wind finds it." There's no context for this line, no explanation, but it feels deliberate. As if he knew the message would lie dormant, unnoticed, until someone with the right perspective unearthed it. When the document was presented to Vatican archivists, the response was cautious. They acknowledged its authenticity, but refused to reclassify the Templar case based on a personal note of ambiguous origin. Fair enough. No signature, no seal, but the timing, the handwriting, the content. Together they raise a compelling possibility that Clement V did not fully support the execution of the Templars, that he may have been maneuvered, manipulated, or more chillingly, simply overwhelmed by the forces aligned against them. It reframes the entire arc of the Templar trials. Imagine a papacy caught between the absolutism of a French king and the silent pressure of ancient knowledge resurfacing in his court. Clement wasn't just trying to manage scandal. He was trying to contain something far more volatile, uncertainty, not about the Templars' faith, but about the foundations of his own. The implications ripple outward. If the Pope himself believed they were innocent or at least not guilty, then the Church's official narrative becomes not just flawed, but suspect. And if knowledge of that doubt was suppressed, deliberately hidden in the forgotten folds of bureaucracy, then what else might have been buried? Maybe this is why so many pieces were scattered, why the Concords were smuggled, why Hugo's cipher was hidden in salt, why Bertrand buried his diary beneath a false wall, why the Rome Intercept warned of the redirected record. They weren't just preserving information. They were preparing for a future reader, someone who might find enough fragments to begin connecting the broken circle. You look again at the addendum. The handwriting is delicate. The ink faded to brown, the paper fragile. But the message has waited patiently, not for exoneration, but for understanding. And maybe that's what history is in the end, not a ledger of facts, but a slow, secret conversation across centuries. One voice hiding beneath another, one truth stitched into the margins of lies, waiting for someone to open the final page. From ashes in the archives to whispers in Chinon, from Malta's darkened vaults to the ciphered scroll of Hugo de Aragon, every piece points toward a coordinated effort, not necessarily by the Templars themselves, but by those who believed them worth remembering. There's a difference. Not every piece fits neatly. Some resist placement, others contradict. But this is not evidence of fiction. It's the hallmark of real historical trauma. Suppressed records don't vanish cleanly. They splinter. They echo. They mutate into myth because no other narrative is allowed. The Chinon parchment, once buried in the Vatican for centuries, revealed that Clement V had absolved Templar leadership of heresy. Yet executions proceeded. Why? Because absolution on parchment means nothing if it never reaches the public. The Rome Intercept implies that it didn't, that the Pope ruled on only partial testimony. And if that's true, then the entire trial collapses under the weight of its own procedural failure. The forgotten addendum suggests guilt. Not theirs, his. A quiet confession, perhaps, that something precious was allowed to slip into fire and ash. Not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. Then there's Malta. A hexagonal chamber, niches for missing objects, a sealed wall behind which something waits. A pattern repeated, in Hugo's scroll, in Bertrand's diary, in architectural oddities and rites echoing from Syria to Scotland. These are not the embellishments of conspiracy. They are the residue of careful preservation. A courier reroutes a message. A scribe marks a scroll with a symbol no one understands. A knight crosses the sea and builds nothing more than a tower, small, strange, and almost too quiet. At every stage, the same instinct: preserve in silence what cannot be spoken aloud. And always that central enigma, the Concords. No one knows what they are, not truly. But their echoes remain, in the phrase, that which bends light but holds none, in the bowl carved from 7 layers, in the phrase from the scroll, the ink is hidden in salt, the voice is hidden in dust. This was not gold, not land, not even doctrine. It was something that passed hand to hand, mind to mind, too volatile for parchment, too sacred for decree. Maybe it wasn't a single object, but a tradition, a method of seeing, of decoding the world, something the Church feared, something the crown could not tax, something that required silence to survive. And so the Templars died, not for what they did, but for what they knew. And others in their wake ensured that knowledge didn't die with them. You now return to the letter, the one that began all of this. The impossible letter. The one the Vatican never acknowledged. The one that insisted the Templars were exonerated long before they were condemned. You read it again. And in doing so, you notice something. Not in the ink, but in the folds. Pressed lightly into the crease, a faint indentation. The shape of a seal long broken. Not the papal crest. Not royal. Something simpler. A circle, crossed through the center. The courier's mark for route altered. So maybe the story was rerouted, diverted, lost on purpose, but not lost forever. Here, in this archive of fragments in the dust between lines, the shapes begin to return, the seal broken too late, the diary without its final page, the silence of the Pope, and the final whisper of Clement. They were not heretics. They were only inconvenient. What remains now is not conclusion, but continuity. Because what the Templars may have carried, whatever it was never buried. Only scattered, only waiting. You sit with the pieces now. Not a full picture, no, but enough. Enough to feel the outline of something long obscured. A pattern, a pressure, a quiet thread running through time, not written in ink, but in omission, in margins, in silence. You've walked with ghosts, not the spectral kind, but those made of parchment wax and fading memory. A burned scroll, a sealed chamber, a broken seal, a forgotten addendum. And the question that lingers, not what were the Templars, but what were they hiding? The answer is slippery. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it was never meant to be read plainly. You sense it in the Concords. You glimpse it in the rituals that echoed older traditions. You hear it in the ciphers and prayers that weren't quite Christian. Not entirely. It may not have been a treasure in the usual sense. Not gold, not relics, not power, but rather something dangerous to certainty. A way of knowing. A way of remembering. A refusal to forget that truth can be kept alive not by empire, not by decree, but by the quiet persistence of those who will not let it go. So much was lost, but not everything. Not if someone notices the missing page, the cracked seal, the whisper in the margins. You wonder who else has looked, who else has followed this same trail of fragments and paused just as you do now at the edge of understanding. And you realize perhaps that's what the Templars left behind. Not just secrets, but a task. To look closer, to question, to listen when history falls quiet, and to ask what it is trying not to say. You sleep now. You've wandered far through dust and shadow. Let the images fade. Let the fires dim. The vault is sealed again. The scroll tucked away. The wind has passed through the open window and the page has turned. What was hidden may never be known completely, but it was not lost, and neither are you.